The morning sun cast golden streaks through the windows of Maple Street Cafe, painting the wooden tables and checkered floors in warm light. The lunch rush was building, and the familiar symphony of clinking plates, brewing coffee, and overlapping conversations filled the air. Maya Johnson moved between tables with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp despite the busy morning. She had worked at the cafe for 3 years, building relationships with regular customers and earning respect through her dedication and bright smile. Maya carried herself with quiet dignity, never drawing attention but always present when needed. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, hardworking, and kind to everyone who walked through the door. She took pride in her work, understanding that every interaction mattered. Every table served was an opportunity to brighten someone's day. The cafe had become her second home, a place where she felt valued and appreciated. At 26, Maya was saving money to finish her nursing degree. Each shift brought her closer to her dream of helping people in a hospital setting, but for now, she found fulfillment in the smaller acts of service. She knew the regular customers by name, remembered their usual orders, and always had a warm greeting ready. The work was honest, and she approached it with the same integrity she brought to every aspect of her life. The lunch crowd was thick that Tuesday afternoon. Business executives rushed through quick meals between meetings, construction workers grabbed hearty sandwiches, and elderly couples lingered over coffee and conversation. Maya navigated the controlled chaos with ease, balancing multiple orders while maintaining her composure. Her manager trusted her completely, often leaving her to handle difficult situations because of her natural ability to diffuse tension with kindness. The atmosphere changed the moment the door swung open with unusual force. A police officer entered, his heavy boots echoing against the floor. Officer Bradley Morrison stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the room with the arrogance of someone who believed his uniform granted him unlimited authority. His presence immediately shifted the energy of the cafe, conversations growing quieter as customers instinctively sensed a change. Morrison was known in the neighborhood, though not for positive reasons. His reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. Other officers avoided partnering with him when possible, uncomfortable with his aggressive approach and tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. Citizens who encountered him often left feeling violated, their dignity stripped away by his cruel words and power-hungry behavior. He viewed his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a weapon to wield against those he deemed beneath him. He chose a table in the center of the dining area, positioning himself where everyone could see him. His movements were deliberate, designed to command attention and establish dominance. He adjusted his badge with exaggerated pride, making sure the metal caught the light. His laughter rang out suddenly, harsh and inappropriate, though no one had spoken to him. The sound cut through the cafe's warm atmosphere like a blade. Maya noticed the shift in the room's energy, but continued her work, hoping to avoid any interaction with the officer. She had dealt with difficult customers before and understood that sometimes the best approach was to remain invisible. She focused on taking orders and delivering meals, trying to maintain the peaceful atmosphere that made the cafe special. Her instincts warned her to be careful, to stay out of this man's sight. But Morrison had already noticed her. His eyes followed her movements with predatory interest, watching the way she carried herself with dignity despite her service role. Something about her composure irritated him, as if her quiet confidence challenged his authority. He drummed his fingers on the table, a rhythm that spoke of impatience and brewing trouble. The cafe's regular customers sensed the tension building. Conversations became more subdued, and people glanced nervously between their meals and the officer's table. The elderly couple by the window exchanged worried looks, while the construction workers at the corner booth finished their food more quickly than usual. Everyone could feel that something unpleasant was about to unfold. Maya delivered an order to a nearby table, her professional smile never wavering despite the growing unease in her chest. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming danger. The officer's presence felt like a storm cloud gathering strength, ready to unleash its fury on whatever stood in its path. Morrison's voice suddenly boomed across the cafe, cutting through all other sounds. His words would shatter the peaceful morning and set in motion events that would change everything for Maya and everyone present in that small restaurant. Officer Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the cafe's peaceful atmosphere. "You," he barked, pointing directly at Maya with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Get over here." The command hung in the air like a physical presence, causing conversations to die mid-sentence and forks to pause halfway to mouths. Maya's hands tightened around the tray she was carrying, her knuckles showing white against her dark skin. She had hoped to avoid this moment, but there was no escape now. Every eye in the cafe had turned toward her, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady but cautious as she approached his table. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her to remain calm in challenging situations, but something about this officer felt different, more dangerous. The predatory gleam in his eyes suggested this interaction would be unlike anything she had experienced before. Morrison leaned back in his chair, savoring the attention he had commanded. The entire cafe was watching now, and he fed off their collective unease like a parasite drawing strength from its host. His lips curved into a cruel smile that never reached his eyes. "Bring me a bag of flour," he said, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard. Maya blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me, sir. Did you say flour?" The confusion in her voice was genuine. In 3 years of working at the cafe, no customer had ever requested raw ingredients from the kitchen. It was such an unusual request that she wondered if perhaps he needed it for some official police business she couldn't understand. "That's what I said." Morrison's voice grew even louder, carrying to every corner of the room. "Flour. Go to the kitchen and fetch it. Don't make me repeat myself." His tone dripped with condescension, each word carefully chosen to humiliate and belittle. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the cruelty beneath his words. Maya's professional training warred with her instincts. Everything about this request felt wrong, but refusing a police officer's direct order could lead to consequences she couldn't afford. Her job was important to her, and she couldn't risk losing it over what might be a simple, if strange, request. "Sir, that's not typically something she began, hoping to explain politely. His hand slammed down on the table with explosive force, causing silverware to jump and coffee to slosh over cup rims. The sharp crack echoed through the now silent cafe, like a gunshot. "I gave you an order," he roared, his face flushing red with artificial rage. "You think that uniform makes you better than me? You think you get to talk back? Go get the flour." The words hit Maya like physical blows. She could feel the weight of every stare, the collective held breath of the cafe's customers. Some looked at her with pity, others with embarrassment at witnessing such a scene, but none offered support. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening, filled with the cowardice of those who recognized injustice, but lacked the courage to confront it. Maya's throat tightened with humiliation, but she forced herself to move. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the kitchen, each step carrying her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The cafe manager peered out from the kitchen doorway, his face pale with concern, but he said nothing. His silence felt like another betrayal, another reminder that she was alone in this moment. In the kitchen, her co-workers stared at her with confusion and sympathy. "Flour?" whispered Jenny, the prep cook. "What does he want that for?" But Maya couldn't answer. Her voice had abandoned her, locked away by the crushing weight of public humiliation. She grabbed a heavy bag of flour from a storage shelf, her hands shaking as she lifted it. The walk back to Morrison's table felt like a death march. Every step was witnessed, recorded in the memories of customers who would remember this moment long after their meals were forgotten. She could hear whispered conversations, fragments of shock and disbelief, but no one spoke up in her defense. The isolation was complete and devastating. "Here you go, sir," Maya said softly as she placed the bag on his table, hoping desperately that this would end the ordeal. Perhaps he really did need it for some legitimate purpose she couldn't understand. Perhaps this humiliation would be worth avoiding something worse. But Morrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharp in the cafe's warm light. "Oh no," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness that made Maya's skin crawl. "That's not good enough. Hold it." The command was simple, but its implications were terrifying. Maya's heart sank as understanding dawned. This wasn't about flour or any legitimate need. This was about power, about reducing her to an object for his entertainment. With trembling hands, she lifted the bag again, holding it against her chest like a shield that offered no protection. The weight seemed to double with each passing second. "Closer," Morrison ordered, gesturing with his finger like he was calling a dog. Maya stepped forward, her dignity cracking with each movement. The customers nearby fell completely silent, their meals forgotten as they watched the scene unfold with horrified fascination. Without warning, Morrison's hands shot out and snatched the bag from her grip. Before Maya could react, before she could step back or protect herself, he tilted it forward and emptied the contents over her head. The flour cascaded down in a thick, white cloud, coating her hair, her face, her uniform. It filled her mouth and nose, making her cough and choke as the fine powder invaded her lungs. The laughter that followed was worse than the flour itself. Morrison's cruel glee echoed through the silent cafe, a sound that would haunt Maya's dreams for years to come. "Look at you now," he shouted between gasps of laughter. "Snow White. Maybe now you're fitting better." Maya staggered backward, her world reduced to the taste of flour and the burn of humiliation. She could barely see through the coating of white powder, but she could feel the stares, hear the gasps of shock from the other customers. Some pulled out their phones, capturing her degradation for posterity. The violation was complete and public, witnessed by dozens who would remember her not as Maya, the dedicated waitress, but as the woman covered in flour. Maya stood frozen in the aftermath of Morrison's cruelty, flour clinging to every surface of her body like a second skin. The fine white powder had transformed her from a professional waitress into a spectacle, a living testament to one man's capacity for evil. She could taste the bitterness on her tongue, feel it burning in her nostrils with each labored breath. Her uniform, once a symbol of honest work and dignity, now marked her as a victim. The laughter continued to pour from Morrison's lips, each guffaw driving the humiliation deeper into Maya's wounded spirit. "That's the problem with people like you," he declared, his voice carrying across the deathly quiet cafe. "You think you matter. You think you're somebody, but you're nothing. Just dirt. Flour suits you just fine." Around the dining room, customers sat paralyzed by the scene before them. Some stared with mouths agape. Others lowered their eyes in shame at their own inaction. A few held phones aloft, recording the degradation for social media consumption. The collective silence was deafening, a chorus of cowardice that allowed cruelty to flourish unchallenged. Maya's hands trembled as she attempted to brush the flour from her face, but it only smeared, creating paste-like streaks across her cheeks. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she fought them back with every ounce of strength she possessed. She refused to give Morrison the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken, even as her world crumbled around her. The cafe manager remained hidden in the kitchen, his cowardice complete. Her co-workers peeked around corners, but made no move to intervene. Maya realized with crushing clarity that she was utterly alone, surrounded by witnesses, but abandoned by humanity. The isolation was more painful than the flour, more devastating than the laughter. Morrison leaned back in his chair, surveying his handiwork with the satisfaction of an artist admiring his masterpiece. The power he wielded through fear and badge had never felt sweeter. He had reduced a human being to an object of ridicule, and no one had dared to challenge him. The silence of the crowd was his victory song. But in the far corner of the cafe, in a booth tucked away from the main dining area, someone had been watching with different eyes. John Cena sat quietly, his massive frame somehow unnoticed despite his celebrity status. He wore a simple green shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, seeking anonymity in a world that rarely granted it to him. He had come to the cafe for a quiet meal, a brief escape from the demands of fame. What he witnessed instead was an assault on human dignity that shook him to his core. Cena had built his career on principles of respect, kindness, and standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. He had seen bullying in many forms throughout his life, but rarely had he witnessed such calculated cruelty executed with such public humiliation. His hands slowly clenched into fists beneath the table as Morrison's laughter continued to echo through the room. Every instinct in his body screamed for action, for justice, for someone to stand up and say that this was wrong. The flower-covered woman, standing in the center of the dining room, deserved better. Every human being deserved better. Cena's mind raced through the implications of intervention. His celebrity status meant that any action he took would be amplified, scrutinized, and judged by millions. One wrong move could destroy careers, create controversies, and generate headlines for weeks. But as he looked at Maya's trembling figure, covered in flour and abandoned by everyone around her, the calculations seemed meaningless. He thought of the countless times he had spoken to children about standing up to bullies, about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. He remembered the speeches about respect, the charity work with disadvantaged communities, the principles he claimed to represent. In this moment, all of his words meant nothing if he failed to act. Morrison's voice cut through the silence again, each word dripping with venom. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue." He sneered at Maya. "You're supposed to serve people here, aren't you? Consider this service." His laughter at his own cruel joke was like fingernails on a chalkboard. The sound triggered something primal in Cena's chest. He had heard enough, seen enough. The time for silent observation had passed. With deliberate slowness, he pushed his chair back from the table. The scraping sound cut through Morrison's laughter like a blade, causing heads to turn throughout the dining room. Cena rose to his full height, his presence suddenly filling the space around him. At 6 feet 1 inch and over 250 pounds of muscle, he cast an imposing shadow even in civilian clothes. But it wasn't his physical presence that commanded attention, it was something deeper. An aura of controlled power, of righteousness held in check, of justice preparing to assert itself. His footsteps were measured and deliberate as he walked toward the center of the dining room. Each boot fall echoed in the silence, a drumbeat of approaching reckoning. The other customers began to notice him now, recognition dawning on some faces, while others simply sensed that the dynamic in the room was about to change dramatically. Morrison's laughter began to falter as he became aware of the approaching figure. He turned in his chair, his cruel smile wavering as he took in the sight of the man in the green shirt walking toward him with purpose. For the first time since entering the cafe, uncertainty flickered across the officer's face. Maya, through her haze of flour and tears, looked up to see her unexpected champion approaching. She didn't recognize him immediately, but something about his presence calmed the panic in her chest. The weight of isolation began to lift slightly as she realized that finally, someone was willing to stand with her. The cafe held its collective breath as Cena came to a stop, just behind Maya, his shadow falling across Morrison's table like a physical barrier between predator and prey. The silence stretched taut, pregnant with the promise of confrontation. When Cena finally spoke, his voice was low but carried clearly through the hushed dining room. "Does this look like fun to you?" The words weren't shouted or aggressive, but they carried more weight than any scream could have managed. They were the first words of opposition Morrison had heard since entering the cafe, and they landed like a physical blow. Officer Morrison's face flushed red as he processed the challenge from the man in the green shirt. For the first time since entering the cafe, someone had dared to question his authority. The comfortable silence that had enabled his cruelty was broken, replaced by a tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "What?" Morrison sputtered, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. He gestured dismissively toward Maya, who still stood covered in flour, trying to process what was happening. "She's fine. Just a joke." His words rang hollow in the charged atmosphere, the cruelty of his actions impossible to disguise as harmless fun. Cena took another step closer, his presence seeming to expand with each movement. His broad shoulders and powerful frame cast Morrison's table in shadow, but it was his controlled intensity that truly commanded the room. "A little flour, that's all," Morrison continued, his voice growing higher as he tried to maintain his facade of casual indifference. "She should laugh it off." "You call that a joke?" Cena's voice remained steady, but steel had entered his tone. His eyes never left Morrison's face, studying the officer with the focus of someone evaluating an opponent. That's not a joke. That's humiliation. That's abuse, and you know it. The word abuse hung in the air like an accusation, and Morrison's casual demeanor finally cracked completely. He pushed himself up from his chair, puffing out his chest in an attempt to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. Around the dining room, customers leaned forward in their seats, phones held higher to capture every moment of the unfolding confrontation. "You don't tell me how to do my job," Morrison growled, jabbing a finger at Cena's chest. The gesture was meant to intimidate, to remind everyone present of his badge and the power it represented. "You don't even know who you're talking to." Cena didn't flinch at the pointing finger. If anything, he seemed to grow calmer as Morrison became more agitated. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," he replied, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cafe. "A man who thinks a uniform gives him the right to step on people who can't fight back." Maya watched the exchange with growing amazement. The flower still clung to her hair and clothes, but for the first time since Morrison's arrival, she felt a spark of hope. Someone was finally standing up for her, finally calling out the cruelty she had endured. Her breathing began to steady as she felt the protective presence of her unexpected defender. Morrison's face contorted with rage at Cena's words. The casual cruelty he had displayed toward Maya was nothing compared to the fury now building in his chest. Being challenged publicly, in front of witnesses and cameras, threatened the very foundation of his identity as someone to be feared and obeyed without question. "What are you going to do?" Morrison sneered, stepping closer to Cena until they were nearly chest to chest. The height difference was minimal, but the contrast in their bearing was striking. Morrison radiated desperate aggression, while Cena maintained an aura of controlled power. "You think you're tough? You don't scare me." Around the dining room, conversations had died completely. Every customer was focused on the two men facing off in the center of the cafe, their phones capturing every word and gesture. The manager finally emerged from the kitchen, his face pale with concern, but he remained on the periphery, unwilling to insert himself into the volatile situation. Cena's response was delivered with quiet confidence that somehow carried more threat than any shout could have managed. "I'm not here to scare you," he said, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "I'm here to stop you." The words were simple, but their implication was clear. Morrison had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had committed an act of cruelty that demanded response. The comfortable world where his badge protected him from consequences was crumbling around him. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his utility belt, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The threat was unmistakable, and gasps echoed from several tables as customers realized how quickly the situation could escalate beyond words. "You're going to regret this," Morrison hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the phones, the witnesses, the growing crowd of people documenting his every move. Cena's reply was immediate and final. "No, you will." The promise in those 3 words sent a shiver through the cafe. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions, from rage to confusion to something approaching fear. For the first time in his career, he was facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his badge, someone who seemed entirely willing to back up his words with action. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Morrison's hands clenched into fists, his body coiling like a spring under pressure. Cena remained motionless, but his readiness was evident in every line of his posture. The customers around them held their breath, sensing that violence was about to erupt. Maya stood transfixed, flour still dusting her uniform, as she watched her tormentor face the consequences of his actions. The humiliation she had endured was being answered. The cruelty she had suffered was being challenged. For the first time since Morrison had entered the cafe, she felt like a person again rather than a victim. Morrison lunged forward suddenly, his restraint finally snapping under the pressure of public humiliation. His hand shot out toward Cena's arm, intending to push him back, to reassert dominance through physical force. But the man in the green shirt was ready, his body shifting with fluid precision to intercept the attack. The cafe erupted in gasps and cries as the confrontation finally turned physical. Phones captured every moment as Morrison's desperate attempt to regain control met Cena's calm competence. The storm that had been building since Morrison's arrival was finally breaking, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. Morrison's desperate lunge met empty air as Cena stepped aside with fluid precision, redirecting the officer's momentum with a subtle shift of his body. The movement was so smooth it appeared effortless, but the result was immediate and decisive. Morrison stumbled past his intended target, his balance broken, and crashed shoulder first into a nearby table. Plates jumped and scattered, silverware rang against porcelain, and coffee splashed across the surface in dark streaks. The sound of Morrison hitting the table echoed through the cafe like a gunshot, causing every customer to gasp in unison. Phones lifted higher, recording every second of the confrontation as it unfolded. Morrison scrambled to right himself, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage at being so easily outmaneuvered. Cena didn't advance or pursue the advantage. Instead, he planted his feet and raised his hands, palms forward in a gesture of controlled restraint. "It doesn't have to go further," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. The offer was genuine, a final opportunity for Morrison to walk away with what dignity he had remaining. But pride and fury had completely consumed Morrison's rational thought. He lurched upright, swiping at the dust on his uniform sleeve with shaking hands. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the phones, capturing his humiliation, the faces watching his downfall. The comfortable world, where fear guaranteed obedience, was crumbling around him. "You think you can embarrass me?" Morrison spat, his voice cracking with desperate rage. "You think you can make me look weak?" Without warning, he threw a wild right hook, putting all his frustration and wounded pride behind the blow. The punch was telegraphed and clumsy, driven more by emotion than technique. Cena slipped the punch with minimal effort, letting the officer's fist sail harmlessly past his head. As Morrison's momentum carried him forward, Cena placed a guiding hand on his forearm and turned him with gentle precision. There was no violence in the movement, no cruel flourish, just control. Morrison stumbled again, catching himself on the back of a chair that scraped across the tile floor with a harsh screech. Around the dining room, customers pushed back from their tables, creating more space for the unfolding confrontation. The elderly couple by the window clutched each other's hands, their eyes wide with disbelief. The construction workers at the corner booth leaned forward, their phones capturing every moment of the officer's humiliation. Maya watched from the sidelines, flour still dusting her hair and uniform, but her tears had stopped flowing. For the first time since Morrison's arrival, she felt something other than helplessness. The man defending her moved with such confidence, such controlled power, that she began to believe justice might actually be possible. Morrison's hand moved to his utility belt, fingers closing around the grip of his expandable baton. The metallic click of its release was small but unmistakable in the tense silence. He pulled the weapon free and snapped it to full extension, the sound sharp and threatening. Several customers cried out in alarm at the sight of the weapon. "On your knees," Morrison commanded, pointing the baton at Cena like an accusatory finger. His voice shook with rage and desperation. Now, the weapon represented his last hope of reclaiming control, of reasserting the authority that had been stripped away by Cena's calm competence. Cena's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted subtly, feet moving to shoulder width, hands still visible and open. "Put it away," he said quietly. "Walk out of here. This is done." The words carried no anger or hatred, just an implacable certainty that this confrontation had already been decided. Morrison's response was a harsh laugh that bordered on hysteria. The baton flashed through the air in a vicious arc, aimed directly at Cena's temple. It was a potentially lethal blow, driven by rage and desperation. But Cena's forearm rose to intercept the strike, absorbing the impact with practiced ease. The baton connected with bone in a sharp crack, but Cena's expression never changed. Using Morrison's own momentum against him, Cena guided the baton past his head while stepping inside the officer's guard. Morrison, overcommit to the attack, stumbled forward again. A second strike came immediately, this one aimed at Cena's ribs, but once again the defender was ready. He caught the baton near its base, smothering Morrison's leverage, then used a simple shoulder check to break the officer's balance. Morrison crashed backward into another table, sending water glasses tumbling to the floor in a cascade of crystal fragments. The sound of breaking glass mixed with his grunt of pain as he hit the edge hard. Around the cafe, phones captured every moment of his downfall, documenting his transformation from predator to victim. "Last warning," Cena said, his breathing still steady despite the violence. "Stop." There was no triumph in his voice, no satisfaction at Morrison's predicament. This was simply a man doing what needed to be done to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. But Morrison was beyond reason now. Humiliation and rage had consumed his ability to think clearly. He raised the baton overhead in a final, desperate strike, putting everything he had behind a blow meant to end the fight decisively. The weapon began its downward arc with lethal intent. Cena stepped inside the strike one final time, his movements fluid and precise. His left arm intercepted Morrison's forearm, while his right hand twisted the officer's wrist sharply. The baton flew from Morrison's grip, clattering across the floor to slide under a booth. Without the weapon, Morrison was helpless against Cena's superior technique and composure. With one smooth motion, Cena threw Morrison over his hip in a textbook judo throw. The officer hit the floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a pained wheeze. He lay gasping on the tile, his uniform rumpled, his authority completely shattered. The man who had entered the cafe, like a conquering tyrant, was now sprawled helplessly on the ground. The cafe erupted in applause, tentative at first, then building into a sustained ovation. Customers stood from their tables, clapping and cheering for the man who had done what none of them had found the courage to do. Maya felt tears flowing again, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than humiliation and pain. Cena looked down at Morrison one final time. "You wore that badge like it made you superior," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent cafe. "But it's supposed to make you responsible. Today, everyone saw what you really are." He turned to Maya, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Are you all right?" Maya nodded, unable to find words for the gratitude overwhelming her heart. The flower still clung to her clothes, but the shame had been washed away by justice. Around the room, customers continued recording, ensuring that Morrison's cruelty and downfall would be remembered and shared far beyond these walls. The cafe owner finally emerged from the kitchen, phone in hand, speaking urgently to emergency dispatch. Other officers would come soon to collect their disgraced colleague. The videos would spread across social media within hours, sparking conversations about abuse of power, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the dignity every human being deserved. As sirens wailed in the distance, Morrison remained on the floor, defeated not just in body, but in spirit. His reign of terror was over, ended not by violence, but by the simple act of one person refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged. Justice had been served, recorded, and would live on long after the flower was swept away and the tables were reset for the next day's service.